Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this presentation for the Walking Basketball Project, which is a collaboration between Tauranga City Basketball and Toi Oho Mai Institute of Technology. The aim of this particular session is to help the participants understand and interpret the results of their DEXA scan. So each of the participants will have received an electronic copy of their printout from the first DEXA scan that they have done. By the end of the session, the hope is that you are able to interpret those results and understand what they mean for you. The brilliant thing about putting this in video form is that you can come back and watch this and re-watch this as many times as you want to help your understanding. Feel free, and I'll kind of re-mention at the end as well, if you have any further questions, to email me directly to clarify any points that you're not quite sure of. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the presentation and start talking about what is a DEXA scan. So DEXA stands for Dual Energy X-ray Absorptiometry, quite a tough word to say. Essentially a low-level X-ray that scans your body, the bone tissue and the other soft tissues. So it's a measurement technique. It's the most accurate and precise measurement of your bone mineral density and body composition. So by body composition we mean what it's made up of. So not only do we scan bone density, but we're able to assess muscle mass and how much body fat you have as well. At present, it's the gold standard technique and it's used throughout the world. So we're really lucky at Toi Oho Mai to have acquired this machine. It's one of only a handful in the country. And we can use it for projects like this, or particularly useful in working and tracking the progress of athletes within our performance academies throughout the Bay too. All right, there is a lot of information on your printouts, and as I said, hopefully by the end of this presentation you'll understand a little bit more. As I said, you can come back and re-watch it as many times as you like. But we're going to go through and break down each of the areas and what they mean, and give you an idea about what each of the numbers mean and what the important ones are, because they won't all be important to you. So starting off, talking about bone density, so the areas on the scan that relate to bone density in this particular table, which you'll see at least three of throughout your printout. So area in centimetres square, so that's area of bone, BMC in grams, BMD in grams per centimetre squared. I'm going to talk about T-scores and Z-scores, which right now won't mean anything to you, but will become clear as we go through. We're also going to break down these things on the left, so what does it mean when it says radius, 1/3 mid, UD total, all of that kind of stuff. And then what do these things at the bottom mean? WHO classification and fracture risk. Okay, so we're going to go through and break each of those down. So firstly, we're going to talk about two terms on there that you come across, or two abbreviations that you come across. First one is BMC, which is bone mineral content, and BMD, which is bone mineral density. Okay, what do they mean? So they're the two numbers that refer directly to your bone density, and that's obviously an important figure in terms of working out the health of your bones and the risk of fracture going forward as you get older. Okay, so BMC, bone mineral content, is a measurement of bone mineral found in a specific area and is measured in grams. So obviously the scan picks this up without having to kind of biopsy and cut things and tear you open to see what's going on. And so it gives us an idea about how much mineral is found in that section of bone, measured in grams, and it refers to minerals including calcium and phosphorus, which are really important for the rigidity and the structure within those bones. The second figure is BMD, or the second abbreviation is BMD, bone mineral density. So that is a measure of density, so it's the mineral content in a specific area. So we divide the bone mineral content by the area, and we get a number which is measured in grams per centimetre squared. So the density is a much more important number than the content itself. So they both are. Obviously, if your bone mineral content is low, then the bone mineral density won't be great either. Okay, so when looking at these graphs, or these tables rather, on your printout, you'll see that, so it measures area, it measures BMC, and it measures BMD for 3 different areas. So BMC, bone mineral content, for the radius in this case, which is a bone in the forearm, and we'll look at that a little bit more detail further down the track. It gives us a total bone mineral content of 8.02 grams. Okay, so that won't mean anything to you unless you're a bone densitometrist or a doctor or an exercise physiologist that knows how to interpret these numbers. Okay, same goes with bone mineral density. So again, measured in grams per centimetre squared. So it's about density rather than content or concentration. 0.528 grams per centimetre squared. What does that mean to you and I? Not very much. Okay. So what we're going to explore a little bit further are these 2 numbers on the far side of the column, which enable us to make a little bit more sense of what the bone mineral content and bone mineral density numbers mean. Okay, so the T-score and the Z-score, we're going to move on to describe and help you understand going forward. So, to define them, T-score and Z-score, what do they mean? The T-score is a comparison of your bone density with that of a healthy 30-year-old of the same sex. Okay, I'll understand this. I'll explain the significance of that as we go forward in the next slide. Why would we be wanting to compare me to a 30-year-old if I'm much older than that? There's a good reason for that, and I'll explain that slightly more going forward. So the T-score compares your bone density with that of a healthy 30-year-old. The Z-score is a comparison of your bone density with that of an average person of the same age and sex. Okay, so compared with everybody else, if you're 65, you are being compared there to other 65-year-old people of the same sex as what you are. Okay. Why is T-score even important? So surely I only want to be measured against people of my own age. Well, why it's important is that in terms of osteoporosis, according to the World Health Organization criteria, osteoporosis is defined as a bone mineral density that lies 2.5 standard deviations below the average value for a healthy woman. Okay, so what we're looking to assess there with the T-score is, as we get older, our bone mineral density will decline. We're looking to measure how much it has declined compared to that healthy 30-year-old, and for that to give us an indication of whether it is normal decline, whether we're at a level that needs intervention or it needs treatment. Okay, so a T-score of negative 2.5, less than negative 2.5, would be considered osteoporosis. Okay, so you would need to then talk to a clinician and talk about strategies and therapies and potentially medications to help slow that. Obviously, we can't reverse it, but we can put things in place to slow that decline or that decrease in bone mineral density. Okay, so this is a criteria that's been widely accepted in many member states, so that it provides both diagnostic and intervention threshold. So, as I said, less than negative 2.5 2.5 standard deviations from the mean. Allows us to diagnose osteoporosis, and then obviously give us a threshold where we need to start considering treatment as well. Okay, so to summarise T-score and Z-score. A T-score between 1, +1 and -1 is considered normal or healthy. Okay, so remember that T-score is the one that is related to a healthy 30-year-old adult. Okay, this specifically links to, as we explored in the last slide, specifically links to the criteria for defining osteoporosis. Okay, so T-score between +1, -1 is considered normal. A T-score between -1 and -2.5 indicates you have low bone mass, although it's not low enough to be diagnosed with osteoporosis. So if you're at the lower end of the scale, so it's called, or the terminology is osteopenia, and that is low bone mass, and so at the lower end of that scale, down towards kind of -2, you might be looking at interventions depending on what the other lifestyle factors are. So there's a lot of factors that determine your bone mineral density. So nutrition, activity, heredity, all of those things have an impact on what your bone mineral density is and how we can treat that. And T-score of -2.5 or lower indicates that you have osteoporosis. The greater the negative number, the more severe. Okay, so if you're sitting at -4, that's quite bad. That's, that'd be worse than somebody that was sitting right on -2.5. Okay, so right on that threshold. So we're just going to, the next slide, we're going to go back to school a little bit and talk about normal distribution. So when we're talking about standard deviations, you may a curve that looks something like this for normal distribution, where our 0 in the middle is the mean. Also, that's the average. So if we're talking about bone mineral density, that's the average bone mineral density for your age group. If we're talking about T-score and relative to defining osteopenia or osteoporosis, then this is the mean or the average of that 30-year-old, that healthy 30-year-old, either male or female, depending on what you are. Okay, so the same sex as what you are. So standard deviation is a statistical term to define the spread, I guess, of these numbers. So this standard deviation normal distribution curve, or the bell curve, known for its shape, what it means is, so when we're talking about -1 and +1 with the T-score, this is what it refers to. So if you're sitting between -1 and +1, you are in the majority. So 68% of people in your age group and of your sex will be within +1 and -1. Okay. Obviously, that gives us an idea. So, if you were on 0, that would mean that your bone mineral density or content would be exactly the same as that healthy 30-year-old that we're comparing ourselves against. So if you were on -1, obviously you're slightly lower than that. So from the mean, you'd be lower than that. And again, as you get lower, -2, -3, -4, obviously you can see there's less people out there. But that's where you're at risk, and that's where we need to talk about or think about those strategies around, doing things to help slow the decline of that bone mineral density. Obviously, on the plus side, there's always potential for you to be higher or on the high side of that, and you may see a few of those where you're in the positives or up at 0.5 or up at 1 or up at 2, and that's great. So just so you understand that mean is at 0, so the plus 1 and minus 1 when it comes to the T-score and the Z-score is related to the standard deviation curve. So that's just an important concept for you to understand. So if we go back to the same graph that we looked at, relating to bone mineral content and bone mineral density, again, those raw numbers, they don't mean much to you. Okay, if we're looking at this particular person's printout, their T-score, so remember that's the one that's relative to a healthy 30-year-old, is negative 1.0. So that fits within the healthy range that we're talking about, which was between negative 1 and 1. So there is less risk. So the bone mineral density of this particular individual is pretty good compared to a healthy adult at 30 years. Okay, the Z-score, remember that's the one that relates specifically to people in your same age group and sex. So this person is positive 0.4, which means they are slightly above the average or the mean when compared to others of their age group. So obviously in terms of value, that's great. But if we're looking at the definition of defining osteoporosis, or the risky kind of in-between of osteopenia, then it doesn't give us much information there. So it's great to know that you're where you sit there, but the most important figure for us is actually, so not the T-score of 1, not the Z-score rather of 0.4, but the T-score of 1. Okay, so we're going to move on briefly. So through your printout, you'll see graphs like this for each one. So this one's titled neck. It's not talking about your neck. It's talking about the neck of your femur, which we'll explore in a little bit more detail a little bit later. So this just graphically represents those standard deviations for your T-score. Okay, so remember that's the one that is related to the standard deviations. So the colours on this depict the areas of risk. So if your dot is in that green area, so in this case that's sitting at a bone mineral density of about 0.8, giving us a T-score of, it looks to me like about, so what is it? It's slightly more than negative 1, which means we're sitting within the green zone. You can see between negative 1 and negative 2.5, that's a yellow zone, so that would what would be considered osteopenia. And then if you're in the red zone, that would be clinically classified as osteoporosis. Now, you can't go just off a DEXA scan result. You would need, as I said, it's much more complicated than that in terms of looking at lifestyle factors for your risk, but it would be a good point at which to consult with a physician and kind of investigate that further. Okay, so there is that we look at being most important when testing, DEXA testing in terms of the clinical scans, areas of your body where we pick up the most significant areas or kind of markers for us when defining that bone mineral density. So one is the lumbar spine. So it's an important part of our body because it supports pretty much the entire load of our upper body and transfers that load down through our hips, through our legs and into the ground through our feet. Okay, so if we've got issues here in terms of bone mineral density, if you talk about osteoporosis, there's a characteristic kind of loss of optimal posture is what I'm going to term it. But that hunch that older people can sometimes get when they're diagnosed with osteoporosis, because the integrity of each of the vertebrae in their spine isn't great, as well as the discs and the other soft tissues, it can lead to some pretty serious complications here. So labelled on the diagram on the left, L1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, so those are the lumbar vertebra, those are the ones right in your lower back. So L5, which sits just below there, this bit here, that essentially sits on top of the sacrum, which joins, and your sacrum sits in the middle and your hips join on the outside of that. Okay, so really important here. This breaks down those, so you can see the T-scores and the density in each area, which is great. For the most part, what we're most interested in is the total. Okay, so what we can see with this particular one, the most significant number for us on this whole table is that one there, the T-score of 0.9, which puts us on the higher end of the normal scale. So remember, our normal was between -1 and +1 in terms of standard deviation. So we're at 0.9, so we're at the higher end of that scale, which is great. Okay, remembering again that compares us to an average 30-year-old, so our spinal health is looking pretty good right now if this is your score. Again, if it's say below -1, if you're -1.5 or -2, then that would be an area of concern that we might need to look into. And again, the second number, not as important, but compared with other people of your age, this particular individual sits 2.5 standard deviations above the mean. So they're well above average for their age, and they're above average in terms of their healthy 30-year-old as well. So this person's spine is in really, really good shape. The other thing you'll notice on this printout is that down the bottom here on each one, it talks about the WHO classification. So WHO isn't the band from the 70s, that's the World Health Organization, remembering back to a previous slide. So the classification for this person is normal, and the fracture risk is not increased. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide. So the next most important one would be your hip. Okay, probably the site of most common site of fractures in elderly in terms of what our health system sees clinically. So again, another really important area for us within this DEXA scan to assess to see where each of our individuals is at. So as you can see, again, it's split up into 3 separate areas. For us, we're going to focus again on the total. You can see on the visual, on the picture on the left-hand side there, if you want to know the names, you can. So trochanter is just the knobbly bit up on top here of this green section. Intertrochanter is just this area, and then the neck of the femur, which is probably where we get the most issue with fractures as you get older, is the third area. So you can see it breaks that down again, which is more interesting as a clinician, not so much as the person who's reading this and just wanting to know where they're at. So we're much more interested in the total numbers. So for this particular person, for their hip, the T-score is 0.5. So again, we're just over that average. So 0.5 standard deviations above the mean, which is great, related to our healthy 30-year-old. So this person's again in a wonderful place for their bone mineral density in this area. Their Z-score, so relative to their age and gender, is 1.6. So 1.6 standard deviations above the mean. And again, that puts them in a really good place in terms of being low risk. So again, WHO classification is normal. What we're going to move on to is I'm going to show you one that doesn't look so amazing. So again, we've got a different printout here, so different person. Their T-score at negative 1.5. So remember, if we're above 0, that's above the mean. If we're below 0, that's below the mean. So this is 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. A T-score of negative 1.5. So remember, that puts us lower than average and in that range where our bone mineral density is considered low, and not clinically osteoporosis yet, but we're on that pathway. Okay, so remember, negative 2.5 or lower would be considered osteoporosis. Negative 1.5 puts us in that osteopenia kind of bracket in the higher end, but again, it might not need clinical intervention, but you might look at adjusting some lifestyle factors in terms of how much exercise you're getting. Vitamin D supplementations, mineral supplementations, changing your exercise routine, looking at nutrition, all of those types of factors might be things that you could change at this point to slow that decline. So you can't reverse it, but you can slow that decline so we slip towards that high risk area of osteoporosis a little bit slower. And again, so this person's still slightly higher than average for their age, okay, at 0.4, but that's not particularly meaningful in the sense that what it means is most people in that age group would be starting to head into that risky category, okay? So even though you look at that and go, well, I'm pretty good, I'm still better than average for my age, that's great. But in this particular case, that also means that most people in that age group of that sex are also slipping into that area of osteopenia and potential risk for osteoporosis going forward. So they need to think about addressing some of those things. Again, at this point, you might not look at clinical intervention, but it's something that you might want to do a little bit of research and start to do everything that you can to slow that process. Okay, so in this case, we've now got a WHO classification of osteopenia, so like we talked about. If this was negative 2.5 or less as a T-score, then that would be classified as osteoporosis, and then would need to actually have clinical intervention and involve the doctors and the other medical professionals in managing that. So knowing that this only assesses risk, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a fracture or anything like that. We're looking to detect the changes in concentrational density, and then, like I said, we can modify. There's a lot of factors that we can modify to try and minimise that risk going forward. The last one that we decided to have a look at, so when Cam and I had this corridor around doing this project, he said, I'm going to take a scan of the wrist as well. So it's not so important for our general population, but we thought it would be one that would be great to show how hopefully some of that loading that you ladies put through your upper body and your arms and engaging in the walking basketball program, this might give us some really good data compared to what the average population. Okay, so again, on the left there, it's got those areas of the radius in this case broken down. Not super important if you want to know. UD is ultra distal, which just means it's the furthest from your trunk. In this case, from your shoulder joint. Mid distal, and then 1/3 distal. It's just referring to the different aspects there. So you can see that's broken down on the graph. Again, the number we're most interested in is this one here. So again, this particular person for the wrist is right on the bottom end of that average zone that we talked about being ideal. So between 1 and -1. This is a -1 T-score, that's great. Again, so right now we're not in a particularly risky place, but going forward, again, it might mean that it's a smart thing to do to look at modifying some of those lifestyle factors. Z-score, again, 0.4, so that's slightly above average compared to the other people in this person's age group. Again, looking bigger picture, what that means is that particular age group, again, is slipping down towards that high risk kind of area. Okay, if average for the age is on the low end of normal for the T-score. Okay, one of the other tables that you might see on your printout looks like this. Craig, what the heck is a FRAX report? Essentially, that takes all of the information that you've seen in your scan and assesses your 10-year fracture risk. Okay, so you might see something like this on your printout which says FRAX not reported because all T-scores for spine, total, hip total and femoral neck are at or above -1. Okay, so if they're all in that normal age group, then the 10-year fracture risk is not reported. So if that's you, then again that puts you in a slightly lower risk position than someone who on their report would have something like this. So here's someone who's on the lower end of the scale, so 10-year fracture risk. They have listed some of the other factors there, so that the chance of a major osteoporotic fracture within the next 10 years are 11%. So this person is still relatively low, but it's something to consider, much more than the person that didn't have any risk at all. Risk of a hip fracture in the next 10 years, 2.3%. So I'd take those odds, that's pretty good. If those numbers start to get higher, obviously then you're at higher risk, okay? So it's one of these markers or warnings for us to go, hey, I need to think about improving these lifestyle things or changing the things that you can to try and minimize this. So one of the best things that all of you are doing, obviously, are engaged in physical activity, so walking, basketball, plus all of the amazing things that you do outside in terms of walking with your friends and gardening and all those types of things will help. There may be other things that you can do to improve that in terms of supplementation, so mineral supplements, vitamin D supplements, improving diet, improving other lifestyle factors that all impact on this here. And again, this is only a marker, it's only an estimate. It's not to say, so out of 100 people that would get a score like this, 11 of them potentially would end up with an osteoporotic fracture in the next 10 years. Okay, and the same specifically with the hip fracture, because remember we measured specifically that neck of femur, which is one of those high risk areas when it comes to osteoporosis and bone mineral density. One of the other statistical numbers that we'll see in the last 3 or 4 graphs that we're going to look at is a percentile score. So you may understand this already. You may remember this from, I think, back to every time we took one of our children along to Plunkett and they kind of rate their height and weight with percentiles. That's the same kind of thing that we're looking at here, and you'll see in the graphs. So it relates to that normal curve as well. So the percentile scores on a scale from 0 to 100. So if you're at 50%, you would be considered that you have average, so whatever's being measured. If you are above 50%, between 50 and 100, you would be above average. And if you're below 50%, then you'd be below average. Okay, so depending on what you're measuring, that's different. So you'll see it relative to bone mineral density, which obviously higher is better. You also see it with relation to body fat, which for overall health is less desirable. So we want to be on the lower side of that percentile graph. So again, just so that you can understand or kind of conceptualize or visualize some of those figures that we're going to see in the graphs that are coming up over the next couple of slides. So, body composition, okay? What we are going to look at is numbers related to body composition. This breaks down every single part of your body. So you can see there down the left-hand side, the region, left arm, right ribs, right ribs, thoracic spine, lumbar spine, pelvis, right leg, left leg. That's interesting, but it's less important to us than the overall T-score and Z-score. So again, this tells us our overall area, tells us our overall bone mineral content and bone mineral density. Unless we're a professional in that field, the numbers don't mean much to us. We make sense of it using those, the T-score and the Z-score. So for this person, their T-score, minus 0.8, sits within that kind of normal range, that one standard deviation from the mean. So we're looking pretty good overall. Okay, so for bone mineral density overall, this person would be within that normal range. The Z-score at 0.1, minus 0.1, almost bang on average. So very slightly below average, might be the 49th percentile, but pretty close to in the middle. Okay, so remember that's the age-matched one. The T-score is the one we're most interested in because that's the one clinically they use to diagnose osteopenia and osteoporosis, and we're with this person is within that normal range. Okay. A lot of graphs you'll see. This one, which shows you on the left-hand side, there's a visual representation of what your body looks like under the underneath. So you can see the blue, dark blue, light blue. That's the bony bits. You can see the red or the dark orange. Those are the muscles that help you move. And then the yellow stuff there, that's the fat, that's the squidgy stuff. Okay? So obviously, having this to break down body composition is really cool. What it allows us to do is, as well as, we'll focus mostly on bone mineral density for now and osteoporosis risk. Now we can start to talk about muscle mass and maintaining that. So that's really important as you get older because it's functional tissue. It means it still allows you to do the things that you want to do. And obviously, if we can carry less body fat, then it also makes our lives easier in terms of what we're doing. So again, it's broken down: left arm, right arm, trunk, left leg, and right leg. We've got totals here, which are probably more important to us, and we've also got two down the bottom, which relate to android and gynoid. So when they talk about those and the ratios between those, that we'll see in the next table, they are something that are used as an indicator of risk for things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So android fat or fat around the midsection is much more higher risk than fat around the hips. So generally speaking, males tend to put on body fat around their midsection rather than their lower body. Females tend to store it a little bit more around the hips and the legs. So unfortunately for us males, because that sits around our major internal organs, that's much more high risk in terms of increasing our chance for heart disease. So again, if you're one of those that has like an apple body shape with skinny legs and a round torso, that's a high risk space to be. So that's the differentiation here. So the totals we're going to look at: fat mass 39,368 grams. That sounds like a lot. 39 kilos, give or take, right? Lean mass, so that is everything except body fat, okay? So that includes muscle and that includes your bone, all right? So that's not just muscle mass, that's muscle and bone and all of the other soft tissues, the organs, all right? So we're just separating those two. 52,384, just over 52 kilos. For a total mass, 91.7 kilos. And again, body fat percentage, 42.9. So without being an exercise physiologist or a trainer, those numbers won't mean anything to you. You may have heard body fat percentage before. If you go and Google that, you might be able to find some information on it. What we need to know mostly we've got two numbers here. So young normal, which is 20 to 29 age group, you would be in the 82nd percentile. So that'd be well above average for a 20 to 29 year old. Okay. The number we're most interested in for this, so you know, it's essentially the same as the difference between the T-score and the Z-score for bone mineral density, but we're more interested in the age-matched one here, okay? Obviously, it gives us a reference point for decline as we get older. So this person is in the 82nd percentile when compared to 20 and 29-year-olds of their sex. When they're age matched, so other people their age, they're in the 51st percentile, which means that they are pretty much bang on or just above average body fat for their age, okay, which is not a bad place to be. Okay, so looking at this table, we've got a whole lot of numbers there. Again, most of them won't mean much to you, so they'll be much more beneficial to a professional that's working in the field. So the first one that we saw on the last table was percentage body fat, 42.9. You'll look at that and go, oh, that seems quite high. 42.9% of my body mass is fat. Oh, I don't like the sound of that. Again, we're going to skip the young normal here because we're not interested in comparing you to 20 and 29-year-olds. There's no clinical significance here. It can offer us a benchmark in terms of if you were closer to that age group, so you could track it over a period of time in terms of decline, or obviously if you were closer to that age group, it would be more important. Okay, but for us, age matched, 51st percentile means that you're slightly above average, which is a pretty good spot to be in. So that means that 51% of the population in your age group would have less body fat than you, and 49% of the age group in that population for your gender would have less body fat than you. So moving on to the next one, so fat mass divided by height squared, so kilograms per metre squared, 13.1. What does the number mean? Not much to us, really. Age match percentile, 59. So that means that, this is a significant number because if you have the same fat mass but you're taller, then obviously it's distributed differently and you're at less risk. If you have the same amount of body fat but you're a foot shorter, then it's obviously a concern about how that fat is distributed and talking about where it is, trunks or limbs, as we kind of alluded to when talking about android and gynoid distributions in the last couple of slides. So again, 59th percentile means that you have more body fat than 59% of the population, and that 41 have a less of a fat mass to height ratio than what you do. Again, so we want these numbers to be lower, so lower than average is better, but in that kind of first standard deviation or pretty close to average is pretty good. Okay, the next number we're going to look at is percentage fat for the trunk, percentage fat for the legs. Okay, so for this person that's at 0.85, and again what that gives us an indication of is that risk for cardiovascular health. So the closer that is to 1, the higher risk that you have of developing cardiovascular disease, diabetes, because of that high risk visceral fat that sits around your organs. Okay, for us again, that percentage is on the lower side of average this time. So we're at 37. Because we're talking about body fat, we want it to be on the lower side of the mean, which is right here. So 37 is on the lower side. Remembering we want bone mineral density on the higher side of average, ideally. Okay, so again, the number at 0.85 won't mean much to you. 37th percentile, cool. That means I have got a lower body fat percentage around my trunk compared to my legs, so that's great. Okay, in terms of your risk, again, trunk divided by limb fat mass ratio, 0.9, again, puts us in a similar spot, 34th percentile on the low side of average. Great place to be. Okay, we're going to wrap this up by just having a quick look at the node, which breaks down these numbers here. Okay, so I just zoomed in on one of those so you can kind of see or explain what that is. So you can see there that on that picture on the left, A and G refer to android and gynoid like we talked about earlier. Estimated VAT, visceral adipose tissue. Okay, that section that is circled, that's labelled VAT, that's the cross section they're talking about. And again, the numbers don't mean a huge amount to us, but they give us a reference point. So for this, you'll notice there's not percentiles because there's so much variation within individuals for this particular measure. It is more useful in measuring you between scans. So next time you come for the scan, seeing whether that's increased or decreased could be valuable to you rather than finding out what the number is itself. Okay, and for a lot of these numbers, especially around body fat, that's probably more important than anything else. Okay, your team. So the other things you'll notice on here, you've got a graph for that fat mass over height squared, which is one of the ones we looked at on the table briefly earlier. You can see that this person, it's been created or shown visually as a Z-score. Again, so 0, just remembering whether it's a Z-score or a T-score. 0 means it's the average or the mean. Above that means above average, below that means below average. So this has got a kind of range of 0 to +2 and 0 to -2 in terms of where it puts you. So again, that gives you an indication of where you sit relative to your age. Okay, so much more important when it comes to those fat scores to be age-related, important for clinically determining osteopenia, osteoporosis, to be looking at the non-age match. So the scores being relative to that 30-year-old healthy adult that we talked about earlier. Okay, obesity is related or associated with heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and other health risks. So that's why it's important, and that's why it's part of this scan. So we've got the technology to give you all of that information about not only bone density, but how much muscle you have, how much body fat you have, so you can also get an idea of risk here. You'll also see a graph there at the bottom, or a graphic that depicts your BMI, so body mass index. You may have heard of that before. It gives an idea about where you sit in relation to being healthy, underweight, overweight, obese, morbidly obese, all of those kind of things. So the only downside to that is it doesn't take into account muscle mass. So if you are particularly muscular, so if we were to throw all of the All Blacks into this and give us to record their BMIs, in fact, most athletes would be either overweight or obese because they have BMI just uses body weight and height. So it doesn't take into account how much muscle or how much fat someone has. So a complete DEXA scan obviously breaks that all down. So what I'm trying to say is that out of all of the numbers on this report or on this printout that you've got, body mass index is probably the least important because we have a much better breakdown based on all the other numbers we have. And like I said, when we're assessing the T-scores and Z-scores, we can then see how we relate to the population for clinical diagnosis or the population that's age matched, so we can see where we fit in terms of risk. Okay, so that is pretty well the end of it. Obviously, you're not here in person, so any questions, please feel free to email me. I am going to be working on a report for this project over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Hope to get something out before the end of the month or very close to it. But yeah, if you have any questions regarding this presentation or your particular printout, then email me. So craig.davie, craig.davie at toiohomai, toiohomai.ac.nz. So it's craig.davie at toiohomai.ac.nz. Drop me an email. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. As I said, the great thing about putting this video up, because I haven't been able to get out and see all of you, is that you can refer back to it as many times as you like. And hopefully with the visuals, you'll be able to now read your report with a little bit more understanding of what some of the numbers mean and what's important. So all of the numbers there are not important to you. If you have any questions there, hopefully I've covered most of the stuff that you'll see. As I said, I've picked out the more significant things. You're not now experts on how to read a DEXA scan, but you should be able to understand yours a little bit more. And then, as I said, that may bring some questions up about where you sit with those T-score and Z-scores and those different areas there. Okay, so feel free to rewatch this as many times as you like. It's run a little bit longer than I thought, but there was quite a lot of information to get through there. So yeah, so nice to virtually see you. We'll be arranging a second testing for you ladies in the near future, once we are back down to level 1. On corridor with Cam, regarding that second testing date, the requirements for PPE in that small testing room and space between clients was impractical. So we have to wait until level 1. So once we hit level 1, which will hopefully be within the next couple of weeks, then I'll look to nail something down in the calendar, send Jill out and a list, set up a spreadsheet so you can grab your assessment times or your scan times on that day. So hopefully by the time we get to that point, I'll have a report. So once I've got that preliminary report finished, I'll email that out to all of you, including Mark at Tauranga Senior Basketball, and that'll be kind of a summary of what we found for the initial results as a group, and yeah, there'll be some background information in terms of the current research in this area, in this space. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking. That is more than enough for me today. So stay safe out there. Look after yourselves. I look forward to seeing you in level 1. It'll be very interesting to see and compare once you get your second DEXA scan result, what the changes or what difference there is between the first and the second one. So that's going to be quite interesting in terms of the numbers as well. So yeah, look after yourself. I'll see you all soon. Ka kite. Bye-bye now.